Everyone loves a story with a villain. It holds our attention and it galvanizes us against a common enemy. In the field of neurodegenerative diseases, which include Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and others, the victim is the brain and the villain is the abnormal proteins. We have a name for it. We call it proteinopathies, diseases of the proteins. And we have, in fact, accrue a variety of strategies to get rid of this criminal, to take it out of the brain of people that are suffering from neurodegenerative diseases. And despite how well we've done this, we haven't really been able to get much out of that effort. So we've come out empty-handed, and it is time to rethink the narrative about the extent to which brain aging is accelerated by these abnormal proteins. It may be that it is not about how much of these villains we have, these abnormal proteins, but rather how few of the normal proteins we have left. Before we delve into the research that is helping us define what might be the most promising of all interventions, let me back up a bit. I'm a neurologist. I study diseases of brain aging. How do I diagnose conditions such as Parkinson's or Alzheimer's? I do it by asking questions and observing patients. I looked at individuals in terms of how they move, how they talk, how they behave. For instance, if someone is slow, has a tremor in one hand, might shuffle a foot when walking, I would say you have Parkinson's disease. I can't prove it until I have a biopsy or an autopsy, but trust me, I am an expert. And I'm applying criteria that my expert forebears developed a while ago. So how do I really get away with this? How do we neurologists get away with just disclosing a diagnosis in a manner that requires trust? Well, it all began in the early 1900s when our forebears had only one major technology at their disposal, a microscope. And what they did is that they used it on brain tissue of people who had died of impairment progressively in terms of memory, what we perhaps now today call most often Alzheimer's, or people who had progressive slowness and other abnormalities in what we today call Parkinson's. And what they did is that they applied the microscopic techniques, as primitive as they may have been, and when you are doing that, as you can imagine, positioning yourselves in their eyes, they would see on the brain things that look like this, these abnormal clumps, wads of protein. And they looked abnormal, and they looked like they shouldn't be there. So the part of the narrative that began at that point was in assuming that what they had encountered was the cause of the problem. That somehow, as the brain had these kinds of proteins there, that it was the evidence that, in fact, gave rise to the abnormalities, to the degenerations that ultimately created the problems for which the patients died. But are they really the villains? And let me explain how they, in fact, came to be. Normal proteins are, in fact, looking rather like this. As you can see, they are so flexible and light, they can fall off the table. But as you can see, what they ultimately are is so flexible and soluble, that means dissolvable, that they can perform functions. is dissolved in water. The solubility of it allows us to quantify it in the liquid that surrounds the brain, and that we can measure that through a spinal tap. These proteins are all over the brain. They are, in fact, so critical that the genes that code for them have been preserved since prehistoric genomes, and that explains why they are all over the brain. They are critical for the brain's structure and ultimately to keep the neurons communicating one with another. But what happens when we encounter in the brain something that shouldn't be there, something that might be a virus, for instance? Well, these proteins then have something that will be the source for what we call a protein transformation. From soluble, they clumped into these very compact wads, and very similar to what you saw earlier. And ultimately, more of them accumulate, as you can see here. And what happens, therefore, is that the normal proteins are becoming less and less common, less and less in concentration, but the source of the problem becomes invisible. And what we end up with is a lot of this, ultimately. As you can imagine, the normal proteins are now absolutely gone. The aspect of this story that is important to realize is at the end very simple, and that is that proteins are only able to function when they are normal, when they are in this soluble functional state. That the minute they clump into something that they aren't normally in, they no longer function. And the process is universal across all neurodegenerative diseases. It really is one in which, when we ultimately see the transformation of these proteins into the clumps, those proteins are ultimately so compact, so tight, that they are almost impossible to be toxic. This is not unlike milk. Milk is ultimately, if we leave it outside of the refrigerator, it's going to go bad. It's undergoing a soluble to insoluble phase transformation, and that is ultimately what will make the milk curd. Now, you can imagine trying to dissolve the curd, but you cannot imagine bringing that curd back to normal milk. You will never drink it. The paradox that has been greatest in our field is that we have been remarkably successful in eliminating this protein from the brain. We've had the best part of 2 decades testing anti-protein treatments in the amyloid, the synuclein, and more recently, another protein called tau, and the tau proteins. And if you think of the field of amyloids, for instance, there have been over 40 trials testing approximately 20 interventions that clear up the amyloid from the brain, and 75% of these trials have shown that the reduction in this, so if you just imagine that this is kind of coming down, the brain is getting clean, it's been so successful that you would think that if they are the villains somehow, then our brains should return to normal, and people should get back to state of normalcy. Not only has that not happened, but in 40% of the trials, those who were allocated to the experimental arm had the greatest reduction of amyloid worsened. And in many cases, their brains shrunk further. This is a problem. We should be able to look at the data and falsify a hypothesis when the hypothesis fails to be confirmed in clinical trials. So, at this point, we wish to resolve the paradox in the literature, and what we've done is we've studied 600 people who already had plenty of amyloid in their brains. We can measure the amyloid in the brains by using something called a PET scan, and ask the question of what is the difference between people who have these abnormal clumps in their brains and remain normal versus people who have it but are already demented? And we found that the difference is how much of this there's still in the brain. So we actually can have plenty of them, and we've actually now observed that it doesn't matter how much of this there is in the brain. If the levels of the normal protein are high, that individual will be normal. So the story and the narrative about where we are in terms of our development holds on to the narrative that these proteins are toxic. And it is not unlike thinking that a forest ravaged by a storm somehow would be restored back to health by simply cleaning up the broken up trees, right? Reforestation will be needed there, but just taking all the debris won't. So the story is as follows. We now have an enemy that we think of as necessary and sufficient for the development of diseases, and in fact, it isn't. If it were, all of us having these in our brains would have diseases of the brain, and most of us don't, as we've seen. Furthermore, if these were the toxic elements in the brain and we were able to remove them, as we've done, then those who had a removal would be back to health. And that is also not the case. But there is a better way ahead, one that actually thinks about the elements of the story. So rather than insisting that these proteins aggregate and the accumulation of the chunks of abnormal protein are actually going to create the difficulties in the brain, we now have an opportunity and perhaps in our toolbox of future therapies to increase the levels in the brain such that it doesn't matter how much of this we may already have. If we increase the levels of the proteins in the brain, we can in fact get to levels where the brain can operate relatively normal. Now, the way we're doing this is based on a couple of important developments. The first is that the peptides are coming into a brain that's obviously fighting against something. We don't know what that is. This part remains invisible in research. We're saying if you have Parkinson's, trust me, it's a disease. If you have Alzheimer's, trust me, it's a disease. It isn't. It is a syndrome, right? So this is going to be the source of precision medicine. But if we are able to bring the brain, the levels of these normal proteins, to elevate the levels to normal, then it won't matter if we don't yet know what that is. Now, the proteins would have a transformation that prevents them from turning into itself, right? So that hinge that makes that clump appear would be changed, but the rest of the protein remains normal. We have now demonstrated that above a certain threshold, and the threshold is now well defined, patients can be rescued. So precision medicine will require us to get to this, and this is an individualized approach, but rescue medicine would allow us to, in fact, use the opportunity to bring back what the brain is losing in the process of neurodegeneration. I'm working with a number of scientists very interested in moving us into this. We're no longer testing the effects of removing the chunks of was. We're beginning, in fact, to test how to bring this to people affected with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, and other conditions. And as a neurologist, I can tell you I have never been more hopeful. Thank you.